Hi everyone, it's B. Today I'll be answering the age-old question of if shows like Courage the Cowardly Dog or Mr.Meaty are actually as scary as we all remember them being, and if kids shows actually used to be scarier back in the day. If you grew up in the late 90s or early 2000s, I'm sure you probably already know what I'm referring to because you probably had nightmares about these shows yourself. But just in case you're not familiar with these shows, I'll make sure to give you some context before I get into the nitty-gritty of it. Courage the Cowardly Dog was a show on Cartoon Network that originally aired from 1999 to 2002 and had a total of 4 seasons and 52 episodes during its run. The show follows a little pink dog named Courage, an ironic name considering he's scared of literally everything, and his 2 elderly owners, Muriel and Eustace. Courage the Cowardly Dog, though it was technically a kids show, has kind of become infamous over the years for causing many kids to have nightmares because of the show's disturbing episode premises and genuinely terrifying character designs. And terrifying in a legitimate way, not just a terrifying to kids kind of way. Growing up in the early 2000s, there were constantly reruns of Courage the Cowardly Dog on TV, and it was easily my favorite show as a kid. It still is my favorite cartoon to this very day. Though Courage had and still has quite the cult following, there were also a ton of kids that I knew personally growing up that weren't under any circumstances allowed to watch Courage the Cowardly Dog because their parents considered it to be far too scary and mature for them to watch, which is certainly a strange thing to hear being said about a kids show. There are a few standout episodes during the show's 4-season run that are considered by far to be the creepiest, including Season 1, Episode 5, King Ramsay's Curse, Season 1, Episode 9, A Night at the Cat's Motel, Season 2, Episode 12, The House of Discontent, and Season 4, Episode 7, The Mask. The episode that scared me the most as a kid, though, was Season 3, Episode 8, So in Louvre Are We Too, which is the one that takes place in an art museum. For this video, I went back and watched one of the episodes that many consider to be the scariest and most memorable, Season 1, Episode 5, King Ramsay's Curse, sometimes known as the Slab episode. For copyright reasons, I probably can't just play a 22-minute long episode of a children's show on my channel, so I'm just going to tell you what happens in the episode to jog your memory a little bit and maybe throw some stills or shorter clips or something here. The episode starts by following 2 criminals who are being pursued by the authorities after stealing a priceless artifact. To avoid being caught, they bury the artifact beneath a water pump, and immediately after doing this, they hear an eerie voice that tells the criminals to return his slab or suffer his curse. Their car then gets swarmed by bugs and disappears. The next morning, Courage finds the slab buried beneath the water pump and brings it home to Muriel and Eustace. Eustace decides he wants to sell it since he hears on TV that the slab is worth $1 million, but just as he says that, the image of King Ramses himself disappears from the face of the tablet. Courage tries to warn Muriel and Eustace of his worries, but to no avail as usual. A professor then appears at their door asking for the slab, but since he isn't offering any money, Eustace decides to keep it. Later that night, the front door of their home begins rattling, and when Eustace opens the door, he is met with the scene that gave every kid nightmares for weeks. An oddly 3D King Ramses in an entirely different art style than everyone else in the show, swaying in the wind and telling Eustace to return the slab or suffer his curse with his scary, echoey voice.
Return the slab. What? Return the slab, or suffer my curse.
King Ramses then tells him that he will be visited by 3 plagues, each worse than the last, but Eustace doesn't listen, and another image, this time of water, disappears from the slab and their house begins to flood. They retreat upstairs as the water rushes and are pressed against the ceiling of the 2nd story of their home. Courage swims down to the basement and pulls a plug, draining the house of water, and King Ramses is like, "Aw, come on," which is pretty funny. Next, the image of an old-timey record player disappears from the tablet, and unbearably loud music begins playing, and Courage begins frantically looking everywhere for the source of the music, which he eventually finds and destroys. After the 2nd plague, Eustace starts considering giving back the slab, but says $1 million is as low as he'll go, and so the next image of a locust disappears from the tablet, and a swarm of them swirl their way towards the house, destroying everything in their path. Courage and Eustace wrestle over the tablet as King Ramses repeats return the slab over and over while swaying in the wind outside, and the house starts to be eaten by the locusts. Eustace throws the tablet outside but then runs to retrieve it, saying that since the 3 plagues have already run out, he's out of ammo, so he will be keeping the tablet after all. But the locusts start to come after Eustace himself, and it cuts to him screaming, then quickly to Muriel and Courage watching TV the next day, where the professor who visited them earlier is speaking about how King Ramses' cursed tablet has been returned indefinitely to his crypt where it belongs and will stay. Muriel wonders where Eustace is, and we see a scene where an image of him and the 3 plagues have been etched into the side of King Ramses' crypt, and we hear him screaming in the background and wondering what their offer is. After rewatching this episode, which is considered to be one of the scariest and most memorable Courage the Cowardly Dog episodes, which gave probably thousands of kids nightmares in the early 2000s, I'd say that I understand why this episode is considered to be one of the scariest. And I think the biggest fear factor here is King Ramses himself, his incredibly out of place 3D design in an otherwise 2D cartoon, and his wailing echoey voice. Other than that, he doesn't really pose a direct threat, he just kind of stands outside swaying in the wind, and maybe that's what's so scary about him, just how surreal and ghost-like his character is. Do I think that this is too scary for kids to watch? No, definitely not, but I do understand why it would scare them. I mean, I had nightmares about it too, and it may just be that I'm so much older now, but I don't think that this episode is really all that scary. There's a good amount of comedic relief, and the antagonist doesn't really do anything physically threatening other than bringing the plagues. He just kinda stands there, like one of those big noodle guys outside of a car dealership. What I'm going to talk about next, though, is even more infamous and arguably much less suitable for kids' television. The next show I'm going to talk about was another one of my favorite shows as a kid, since I've always gravitated towards weird and spooky things. Mr.Meaty was a comedy horror puppet show that aired on Nickelodeon between the years of 2006 and 2009 and had a total of 20 episodes. The show is infamous for its frankly terrifying and uncanny looking puppets, legitimately gross humor, and I mean like really disgusting and disturbing even by adult standards, and above all else, the tapeworm episode. The show itself was about 2 teenage boys, Josh and Parker, who work at Mr.Meaty, a fast food restaurant at their local mall. Their characters are very similar to Drake and Josh, which was another popular Nickelodeon show at the time. If you're familiar with it, you can imagine Josh from Mr.Meaty as being like Drake from Drake and Josh, and imagine Parker as being like Josh from Drake and Josh. Josh is the popular ladies' man one, and Parker is the dorky, awkward one. Back to the tapeworm episode though. If you ask anyone who has ever even heard of this show or watched it as a kid, I can almost guarantee that this is the single episode that they will remember, as the horror and grossness of it has probably been burned into their minds forever. And because apparently I love to torture myself, for this video I went back and watched the episode. Season 1, Episode 3B, Moochmaster P. The episode starts like all other Mr.Meaty episodes do, at Mr.Meaty. Josh is standing at the register about to enjoy his meatball sub with vegetables, and Parker comes out of the kitchen sniffing the air wildly like a bloodhound. There's an up-close shot of Parker's weird puppet mouth, and he smacks his lips, and there's wet, sticky residue between them. Ew. Parker suddenly runs up behind Josh and scares him and starts begging him for a bite of his meatball sub. He says he can have one bite, and Parker leans over and devours the entire inside of the sub like a vacuum cleaner. Josh tells Parker to go mooch somewhere else, and Parker runs off to do exactly that. Parker goes to bother the mall security guard, Doug, who is holding a donut. He surprises him while he monologues to his donut, and he tells Parker that there's a set of rules in life, and rule number 1 is to never look through another man's donut hole. Either way, Parker schmoozes him into giving him a bite of his donut, and as Parker goes to take a bite, he puts the whole donut and the security guard's entire hand in his mouth, and there's more gross puppet saliva action. Ew. Again. Parker does the same to a girl's grapes, eating the entire bunch in one go, eats another girl's entire burrito, including the paper it was wrapped in, and then heads back to Mr.Meaty and falls asleep on top of a giant pile of food scraps. Josh wakes him up and scolds him for being the mall moocher, and later on, Josh is microwaving a beef patty in the kitchen of Mr.Meaty, and Parker smells it from across the room and runs to steal it, and eats the entire thing raw. He's still hungry though, so he goes to eat some of the chicken nuggets sitting by the fryer, but as soon as he brings one to his mouth, it disappears. He tries again, and the same thing happens. He starts to get scared and begins freaking out. Josh decides to record this happening with his camcorder, and afterwards he plugs it into the TV and plays the video in slow-mo, which reveals a tapeworm jumping out from Parker's throat as he brings the food towards his mouth and stealing it. I'm not gonna lie, I did physically retch when I watched this. Ew. Parker freaks out and starts hitting himself in the stomach and trying to shove his own hand down his throat, but Josh stops him, and instead they try putting a sausage on a string and having Parker approach it. As he steps closer, the tapeworm shoots out of his throat and grabs it. Again, I had to close my eyes because I was getting super nauseous at this point. So, Josh has the sausage string attached to a fishing pole, and he uses it to reel in the tapeworm and rip it out of Parker's stomach. As it's ripped out, it flies up in the air and lands in Parker's arms and begins growling and thrashing around. Josh catches the tapeworm in a frying basket, and a zookeeper walks by and offers them $20 for it, opens his mouth, lets it crawl in, and says, "That's the stuff, she tickles going down," and that's the end of the episode. So, my thoughts after having rewatched the most infamous episode of another show that traumatized a lot of kids back in the day is that, yes, this is definitely as bad as I remember it being and absolutely deserves the infamy that it's received. It is truly disgusting and hard to watch even as an adult. Compared to Courage the Cowardly Dog, this is like leaps and bounds ahead in horror, and do I think this is too scary for kids? Yes, absolutely yes. There is a bit of comedic relief that I laughed at in this episode, but in general, I'd consider this to be for a much older demographic than it was originally intended for. Like, more for someone who's old enough to watch South Park, not someone who just recently stopped watching Blue's Clues. Other than just these two examples, I do think the kids shows from the late 90s and early 2000s were generally scarier and included much more mature content than modern kids shows. They could definitely get away with a lot more. I talked in my video about the legend of Bloody Gur from Invader Zim that show creators for Cartoon Network in particular were kind of known for pushing the limits of what was acceptable to be put in kids' television. In a recent Variety interview with Cartoon Network and Adult Swim president Michael Aweline, he's quoted as saying that when he joined the network in 1996, to their minds, it wasn't a kids' network, it was an animation network. It was for a psychographic, not a demographic. The best animation works on a couple levels and works for a couple of different audiences at once, and I think that's where Cartoon Network proper is coming around to. And in many ways, I think that makes an awful lot of sense. Cartoon Network shows like Courage the Cowardly Dog and Invader Zim, both of which were known for containing creepy, disturbing, or otherwise kind of more mature content while still being marketed towards kids, have both gained quite the cult followings over the years, and fans of these shows are usually kids who grew up watching them, and many shows that aired on Nickelodeon that followed this idea of creating shows that could be enjoyed by more than just young kids have developed these kinds of cult followings as well. I think there's something to be said about how kids shows that are kind of scary or too mature are the ones that end up with the biggest fan bases years after they've been canceled. I think the reason for that is that these are the shows that we remember the most because even though at the time they scared the shit out of us and gave us nightmares, those are things that we'll never forget, and those memories stick with us into adulthood. But I think there is a thin line between pushing the boundaries of what should be allowed in kids' media and creating episodes that are spooky in a fun way, the way Courage the Cowardly Dog did, and making kids' media that is gross and disturbing even by adult standards, the way Mr.Meaty did. I think that's why when people recall Mr.Meaty, they don't think of it nearly as fondly as they do with Courage the Cowardly Dog. So there's definitely such a thing as going too far when pushing these boundaries, and the boundaries probably exist for a reason. Even TV shows that are almost universally beloved, like SpongeBob, had their scary moments. I mean, how could anyone forget the I Had an Accident gorilla episode of SpongeBob that aired in 2003, where the gorilla, not an animated gorilla, but a literal guy in a gorilla suit, unzipped a Patrick bodysuit and began beating the shit out of a burlap sack containing Sandy and the real Patrick, and then ripped SpongeBob in half. It's an iconic episode because of the fact that it's terrifying. Did that gorilla probably give a bunch of kids nightmares? Yeah, it probably did, but did they still remember the episode and look back on it now and remember it fondly? Yeah, they do. And that's what matters. How about the episode where SpongeBob kills the health inspector and him and Mr. Krabs have to bury his body? That's an absolutely crazy idea for an episode of a kids show, but again, it's an iconic episode for a reason and not something I think that any modern kids show would be able to get away with making. I think it's important to mention before I get to my final thoughts of this that users of cable have significantly decreased since the rise of streaming services like Netflix or Hulu. Fewer and fewer people, including kids, are watching network television. And now, as soon as a kid is old enough to have one, they graduate from watching whatever their parents put on the TV for them to watching YouTube on their tablets, and it doesn't really seem like they ever go back to watching cable after that. What this means, though, is that the demographic of kids who are watching networks like Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network are becoming younger and younger, and the shows being played on these networks are becoming more and more toned down to match this younger demographic. Instead of making shows for kids aged 5 to 11, they're now making shows that can be watched and enjoyed by toddlers while they're still confined to watching cable rather than having their own tablets. Obviously, this means that the shows that are now being made for kids have become less mature and the content in them is becoming much more sterilized so that it's suitable for these younger kids. If they continued making scary and suggestive kids shows while having a younger audience, they'd run the risk of losing them too if the parents decided that the few remaining kids shows that there are on network TV weren't appropriate. So yes, kids shows did used to be scarier, but that's because cable shows were all we had and everyone watched the same things. Before YouTube and streaming services, you watched whatever was on TV, and if you lived in a household with one TV in the living room, like I did, whatever you were watching had to be bearable for more than just yourself. Kids shows had to be something that your parents didn't mind having to watch either, so many of them accommodated this by having little adult jokes thrown in here and there that would fly over the kids' heads but still be funny for the parents, or by having shows that have more mature content in them so not just kids would want to watch them. And those are the shows that we all remember so fondly today now that we're adults. We can go back and watch our old favorite shows from when we were kids and enjoy them because they didn't dumb things down, and now as an adult we can catch on to those jokes that we were once too young to understand. Shows that used to give us nightmares are now shows we reminisce about and say, "Oh man, do you remember that show? They don't make stuff like that anymore," when we're talking to our friends. That's the way it should be, and sadly those days seem to be a thing of the past since media consumption now is a much more personalized experience than ever before. We handpick exactly what we watch and when we watch it every day, and the content of that media is exactly what we like because we wouldn't sit down and choose to watch something that doesn't appeal to us right off the bat. With cable, that wasn't really an option unless you just DVR'd everything and watched the recordings. Granted, no one else in the house deleted it before you got the chance. And I'm not saying this to defend cable. I haven't had cable for years, and it's frankly a waste of money at this point, so that's not what I'm trying to say. It used to be a very different thing back in the day than it is now. If you have cable now, why? You have no reason to have it anymore, seriously. At the end of the day, the way that media is consumed now has clearly had to change a lot since we were kids to be able to keep up with advancements in technology and changing demographics. And lucky for those of us who got to experience all of these extremely iconic and memorable shows as they happened, we have those memories forever, and we use our memories of these scary episodes and funny episodes to be able to relate to each other through sharing our "do you remember" stories with one another. So be it if some of them were a little bit too scary for kids or gave us nightmares or scarred us for life. At least we still remember them and can look back on those shared experiences and laugh. Feel free to share some of the scariest episodes of kids shows that you remember from when you were younger in the comments if you feel like it, and as always, thank you for watching. I hope you all have a good day or night or whatever time it is wherever you are, and I will see you all again next time.